The blizzard arrived not with a sigh, but a roar. Wind howled like a banshee through the skeletal trees, whipping snow into blinding sheets that scoured the raw earth. Eleanor stumbled, the thin soles of her boots offering little resistance to the biting cold seeping from the frozen ground. Her cloak, threadbare and soaked, clung to her like a second skin of ice. Days blurred into a numb agony of walking, hunger a dull ache in her gut, fear a sharp, constant tremor beneath her skin. She had lost the trail hours ago, perhaps yesterday. The wagon, her last link to what was left of her past life, had broken down miles back, its contents long since buried under the drifts or abandoned to the elements. All she carried now was a small satchel, a few coins, and the crushing weight of her circumstances. Her husband gone, the small farm lost, and now, this desolate wilderness threatening to swallow her whole. Despair was a physical entity, heavy and suffocating. Just as her legs threatened to give out, just as the white world began to tilt and gray out at the edges, she saw it, a faint, flickering light through the swirling snow. A cabin, small, crude, but undeniably human. Hope, thin and fragile as a spider's thread, pulled her forward. She stumbled through a drifted-over fence line, across what might have been a yard, and collapsed against a rough-hewn door. Raising a trembling hand, she knocked. The sound was swallowed by the storm, a tiny tap against nature's fury. She knocked again, harder, desperation lending her a fleeting burst of strength. Then, silence fell inside, a listening quiet that was almost more unnerving than the storm's roar. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approached. The door creaked open just a crack, revealing a sliver of warmth and lamplight, and an eye that was wary, assessing. He was a man, broad-shouldered, face obscured by shadow and the angle of the door. He did not speak. "Please," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse and raw, barely audible above the wind. "I'm lost, stranded. I have nowhere to go." The silence stretched, agonizing. The eye studied her, taking in her frozen state, the desperation etched on her face, the vulnerability in her collapsing posture. The wind clawed at her back, trying to rip her away from the sliver of sanctuary. Just as she feared the door would close, leaving her to the mercy of the blizzard, it opened wider. He stepped back, a silent, grim invitation. She stumbled over the threshold, collapsing onto the floor, the warmth hitting her like a physical blow, stealing the last of her strength. The man closed the door, shutting out the storm's fury, and stood over her, a silent, imposing figure against the lamplight. His presence was a question, an unanswered one in the small, suddenly quiet cabin. He did not offer a hand, nor did he speak a word. He simply watched as Eleanor, huddled on the floor, shivered violently, snow melting from her clothes and pooling around her. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading, but his face remained unreadable, shadowed by the brim of his hat. He was tall, lean beneath thick, practical clothes, with a stillness about him that spoke of long solitude. After a moment that felt like an age, he turned and moved to the hearth, stirring the dying embers of a fire. Without a word, he added more wood, coaxing the flames back to life. The cabin was Spartan, a rough table, a single chair, a narrow bunk piled with furs in one corner. It smelled of wood smoke, dried herbs, and the clean, sharp scent of pine. No concessions to comfort, just necessity. He returned to the table, opened a small cupboard, and took out a tin cup and a kettle. He filled the kettle from a bucket by the door, placing it near the fire. The mundane actions felt significant in the face of the recent chaos, a small anchor in a world gone mad. Eleanor pushed herself up, leaning against the cold, solid wall. "Thank you," she murmured, the words tasting foreign and inadequate. He grunted, a non-committal sound, still not looking directly at her. He went back to his bunk, sat down, and began sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape the only sound besides the crackling fire. It was a clear dismissal, a boundary set without a single spoken word. Eleanor understood. She was permitted shelter from the storm, but nothing more was offered, nothing expected. She peeled off her wet cloak and laid it near the fire, then her boots. Her feet were numb, swollen. She chafed them gently, the return of sensation a painful prickling. The man, she didn't know his name, didn't dare ask, continued his task, his focus absolute. She watched him from beneath lowered lids. There was competence in the steady strokes of the stone against the blade, a self-reliance that was both intimidating and, she admitted to herself, strangely comforting. He was clearly capable of surviving out here, a skill she desperately lacked. The kettle began to hiss. He rose, poured hot water into the tin cup, added something from a small pouch and set the cup on the table. He gestured towards it with a tilt of his head. Eleanor hesitated, then pushed herself up and went to the table. The drink was bitter, herbal, but warm. It spread a fragile heat through her chest. She drank it slowly, her gaze fixed on the cup, acutely aware of his eyes, though she couldn't see them clearly, watching her from the bunk. She was an unwelcome intruder, a complication in his solitary existence. She finished the drink and set the cup down. "My name is Eleanor," she offered, feeling the need to break the silence, to offer something of herself. He paused in his sharpening, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, assessing. He looked weathered, lines etched around his eyes and mouth, but younger than she had initially guessed. His expression was still guarded, but held a flicker of something else. Patience? Curiosity. He held her gaze for a long moment, and then, quietly, he responded. Silas, the name was a solid sound in the small space, grounding him, making him real. He returned to his sharpening, the brief moment of connection over. Eleanor hugged her knees to her chest, watching the fire. The storm still raged outside, but inside, the silence between them was beginning to take on a different quality, less a void and more a shared space, fragile and uncertain. Days bled into a week, then two. The storm finally abated, leaving behind a world buried under deep snow and a silence that pressed in on the cabin. Survival became a quiet, shared rhythm. Silas hunted, returning with rabbit or fowl. Eleanor, once she had recovered some strength, helped with the chores, chopping wood, melting snow for water, mending Silas's worn clothes with thread from her satchel. Dialogue remained sparse, functional. Instructions about tasks, observations about the weather, never venturing into personal history. Yet, a silent understanding grew between them. Eleanor observed Silas's quiet competence, his respect for the wilderness, his ingrained self-sufficiency. She saw how he moved with a quiet grace despite his size, how he noticed everything, the slightest change in the wind, the distant cry of a predator, the subtle shift in the snow's texture. He was a man honed by solitude and hardship, stripped down to essentials. Silas, in turn, watched Eleanor. He saw that she did not complain, did not demand. She did what needed doing, her hands calloused but capable, her eyes holding a quiet determination that belied her initial fragility. He saw the shadow that sometimes crossed her face when she thought herself unobserved, the weight of grief or loss she carried. He never asked about her past, and she never volunteered it. The cabin, initially a place of fearful refuge, slowly transformed. It was still Spartan, still remote, but the shared work, the mutual reliance, the quiet presence of another soul made it feel less like a cage and more like a sanctuary. The fire became the heart of their small world, the place where they sat in companionable silence in the evenings, the only light source besides the moon reflecting off the snow. One afternoon, while Silas was out checking traps, Eleanor was by the window, looking out at the vast, white landscape. It was beautiful in a brutal way, but also isolating, dangerous. Her past felt impossibly far away, a dream she had woken from. A sound startled her, not the wind, but the distant crunch of footsteps on snow, too heavy for an animal. Her heart leaped into her throat. She scanned the white expanse. Two figures, dark shapes against the snow, were approaching the cabin. They moved with a purpose that felt menacing. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile piece she had found. Silas returned minutes later, stamping snow from his boots. Eleanor rushed to him, pointing towards the approaching figures. "Silas! Someone's coming." His expression, usually guarded, tightened. He moved quickly to the window, his gaze sharp and focused. "Two of them," he stated, his voice low. "Riders left their horses back yonder." He turned from the window, his eyes meeting Eleanor's. For the first time, she saw something beyond caution in his gaze, a flicker of concern, and a deep, ingrained readiness. "Get behind the table," he instructed, his voice calm, authoritative. "Stay low." He went to his bunk and retrieved a rifle, checking the action. The sound was stark in the quiet cabin. Eleanor obeyed, her hands trembling, her breath catching in her chest. The solitude that had been their protection now felt exposed. Who were these men? And why were they seeking out this remote cabin? The silence stretched taut, punctuated only by the click of the rifle's hammer and the steady thump of her own fearful heart. The men reached the cabin, their shapes looming large outside the small window. One knocked loudly, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sudden quiet. Silas stood near the door, rifle held casually but ready. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice level, betraying nothing. A gruff voice responded, "Lookin' for a woman. Traveler. Blonde hair, wearin' a blue cloak maybe. Heard she might have passed this way." For the big blow, Eleanor froze behind the table. Blue cloak. That was hers. These men weren't lost travelers. They were looking specifically for her. Fear tightened its grip, cold and nauseating. Silas paused, his gaze flicking to Eleanor, a silent question hanging in the air. She met his eyes, shaking her head minutely, a desperate plea not to reveal her presence. He understood. His expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Ain't seen nobody," Silas replied, his voice flat and final. "Been holed up here through the storm. Ain't much travelin' in this weather." A moment of silence from outside. Then, the gruff voice again, laced with suspicion. "You sure 'bout that, mister? Pretty remote out here. Easy to miss something." "I'm sure," Silas stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now best be on your way. Storm's gone, but the cold ain't. Be dark soon." There was a low mutter between the two men outside. Eleanor held her breath, listening. She heard the crunch of snow as they moved away from the door, followed by the fading sound of their footsteps receding. Only when the silence returned, deep and unbroken save for the wind sighing through the trees, did Eleanor dare to exhale. She pushed herself up, her legs shaky. Silas lowered the rifle, though he kept hold of it. He looked at her, his gray eyes piercing. "They were looking for you," he stated, not a question. Eleanor nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," she hesitated, then knew she owed him an explanation, however brief. "It's complicated. My husband passed. His relatives. They didn't like that. He left me everything. They want it back." Silas watched her, his face expressionless. He didn't ask for details, didn't pry. He simply absorbed the information. He looked out the window again, scanning the landscape until the figures disappeared from view. "They might be back," he said, turning back to her. "Or others." It was a simple statement of fact, acknowledging the danger that had now found them. Eleanor nodded. The fragile piece was broken, replaced by a new, sharper reality. But something had shifted. Silas hadn't just given her shelter. He had actively protected her. He hadn't judged or questioned. He had simply acted. The unspoken bond between them solidified in that moment, forged in shared danger. "I can't stay and put you at risk," Eleanor said, though the thought of leaving the safety of the cabin, of Silas's quiet strength, sent a wave of despair through her. He met her gaze again, and this time, there was something different in his eyes, a quiet resolve, a shared acceptance of the challenge. "Storm's gone," he said, gesturing out the window, not towards departure, but towards the world they now faced together. "But winter ain't, and looks like the wolves aren't the only predators out there." He didn't say she had to stay, didn't offer grand promises. But his presence, solid and capable. His refusal to turn her away now that the threat was clear was an answer. They were no longer just two strangers brought together by chance. They were two people who had found an unexpected partnership in the face of a harsh world. The journey hadn't ended at the cabin door. It had just begun, side by side. Her vulnerability hadn't been her end. It had led her to a strength she hadn't known she possessed. A strength reflected in the quiet, resilient man beside her. The cabin, their small sanctuary, now felt less like a place of hiding and more like a place of defiance, built not just of wood and stone, but of shared trust and the quiet courage to face whatever came next, together.